Hey, what's up? And welcome to this episode of EST, the podcast for established church leaders by established church leaders. My name is Josh King.
My name is Sam, and I'm wearing the same clothes as I was in the last episode.
Yeah, about a week ago, we were wearing the exact same things. If you're watching this on
It's
YouTube.
strange how that worked. I mean, I look exactly the same.
Shout out to those who are watching on YouTube. Yeah. Hey.
Yeah, man.
Welcome.
I know most of it. So I'm going to brag. I'm not even going to say it's a humble brag. I'm just going to brag. Really, it's a thank you to our listeners. We're actually seeing quite a significant bump in those of you who are tuning in. Thank you. We're almost at 14,000. In fact, some months over 14,000 listeners. So that's really amazing to me, because when we started this show, we were like, hey, maybe we'll reach a couple hundred. You know, it's like we had no idea.
Right.
And so we are seeing a lot more of you listening and tuning in. So thank you. And we're on YouTube as well. So I know most of you are listening to this, but some of you are watching. And if you're watching, then you've picked up on the fact that, you know, we do record a couple episodes together when we record. So they're back to back in our brains, but they're spread out by a week in the production schedule. And I just realized if you're binge watching on YouTube, like I didn't change.
Yeah.
I didn't change clothes.
Yeah, and let me say, this is how I sort of imagine this. A lot of our episodes are really helpful, and sometimes we're speaking directly to church leadership, say like a pastor. On the other episodes, sometimes we're speaking to like maybe something that a pastor search team could listen to, or a deacon team could listen to, or small group leaders. And so I kind of envision that the YouTube audience or the YouTube resource would be a little bit more conducive to that sort of audience if you got your deacons together and said, watch this. Let's watch this together. That's a little bit easier than let's all sit around and stare at each other as we listen to an audio recording. That's awkward. But at least watching something can help, you pass this resource along to those in your church. You're like, I didn't say it. Sam and Josh said it, and we're happy to say it for you.
Yeah, I like that. I think that's a good idea. If you're tuning in while you're driving in your car, you should not be watching on YouTube. You should be listening. And you're like, hey, yeah, I have a certain group that would benefit from this. Yeah, go to the YouTube channel and pull it up, show it to them. Hey, good stuff. Good. And we certainly want to give props to our sponsor, Church Teams, run by Boyd Pelly, who is just really an amazing guy. And often, the founders of companies and the people who run these companies, they don't really necessarily want to be known. They just want their company to be known. And I know that's how Boyd feels. But I want to speak to when you bring Church Teams on as your church management software system, there's people that run it, and there's people that have made it and created the things that are there. And those people are really amazing. And so I just want to give props to Boyd and his team at Church Teams. And if you're interested in a new church management software system, you should give them a call. They do all sorts of stuff. I mean, really, if it's church management software, they can do it texting, they can do it giving, they can do it scheduling, they can do it. They can help with just about anything that's digital. And hey, they'll start for free. They will work for free for 2 months. And the way that you get that is at est.church. So just go to est.church. It'll take you to a landing page, and you can sign up for just a little free mini consult. They can help you out. Absolutely love what they do. And the prices are right on, particularly for churches that are smaller churches. They've got some really good deals there. So go check them out, est.church. Thank you, Church Teams, for sponsoring the show. All right. Did COVID permanently change trust in church leadership, Josh King?
Yes.
Or as we said on the last episode, King Josh.
King Josh, that's me. I need to change my little name here on the deal. But yeah, I think so. I am hearing, just yesterday, I heard a story about a pastor. I was talking to him about a change that he made. And to be really honest with you, on the surface, he was announcing that he was going to a new church. And that's great. That happens all the time. And so celebrate him for that, even though he will remain nameless in this episode. But on paper, on surface, it did not look like it looked, we sometimes talk about lateral moves. this looked like a less than lateral move. It honestly did. And so I was a little shocked, and I was like, dude, tell me what's going on here. And he told me about God's leadership and how Spirit led him into those directions, and that's great. As he started to unpack some of the factors that were going on, though, one of the things that he talked about was post COVID. He was leading along. He's a a fine leader, a strong leader, respectful and kind to his congregation, and yet he began to be attacked primarily through the personnel team and other issues that were going on. There are no accusations. Here's the thing that I'm noticing about these stories. There's no accusations of impropriety. There's no accusations of immorality. There's no accusations of being unethical. None of the things that you would say, yes, the personnel team, the deacons, etc., they should be up in arms. That is their rightful role to say, hey, you are stepping out of line. None of that is happening in these stories that I'm hearing over and over and over again. What's coming up is this glaring distrust of leadership, and nearly everybody charts it back to one of two cultural phenomenons that have happened in our country. The first one being the 2016 and 2020 election cycles. So with evangelicals being heavily involved in Donald Trump and his candidacy, which was void of any sort of morals or ethics and his character and integrity. So evangelicals pushing that candidacy so strongly. Then also with COVID happening, and I think things like, hey, we're going to go into lockdown for 2 weeks, and if we just go into lockdown for 2 weeks, then we will kill the curve. You remember that? You remember going into lockdown for 2 weeks and it lasted like 3 years? That sort of stuff really made people question authority. There was this stuff where Trump was being unfairly attacked from one side and sometimes fairly attacked from the other sides. And there's mudslinging and all this kind of stuff to where it really just questioned, is there really any actual authority? And I think we came out of that cycle scared and hurt, obviously. I think a lot of people did, but just really viewing authority and leadership skeptically. Do you see anything like that elsewhere?
I do, and I agree with you in principle and in part.
Okay.
So, like, generally, yes. I guess, yeah, that's what I'm saying. I guess I generally agree with you. I do believe that we're seeing the flashpoint of something that had been building for quite some time, maybe over the last 30, 40 years. In terms of the breakdown of institutional trust in the United States.
That's true.
I don't think Donald Trump caused all of it.
No, of course not.
Yeah, I think he's a convenient target for people. And because he's so polarizing and quite frankly bombastic, he makes for an easy target.
Right.
But I think he's just that whole controversy, whatever side of it you're on, was merely a symptom of a greater issue that's occurring. But his candidacy and all that surrounded that definitely brought it to the surface.
Yeah.
And then you add to that this global pandemic and how much people differed on a path forward, particularly in 2020. We started to figure things out a little bit later. At least I think we did here in Florida. Some of you are like, oh, no, we're still struggling with these things. Because what my experience in Florida was very different than what other people experienced.
Yeah.
And I don't mean to get overly political here, but it does involve politics. And really, since the rise of the moral majority, with Jerry Falwell and others. And, I think there was some good in all of that, by the way. I don't view it all negatively. There is this intertwining of the church with politics in ways that, kind of had always been there. I mean, goodness, there were pastors that were fighting the Revolutionary War. So, I mean, we talk about separation of church and state, which, by the way, is a Baptist principle. Most people don't realize that. Do your research there. Jefferson was writing to the Danbury Baptist Association. This is the Baptists who wanted it. So for those of you who are from my tribe, just know what you're talking about when you talk about separation of church and state. But we've always had this intertwining of politics. I mean, I do believe we're a quote unquote Christian nation. I'm not a Christian nationalist or anything like that, but there's a lot of principles that we're founded on that root back to the Judeo-Christian value set. That may be a bit controversial, but that's just what I believe. You can at me on Twitter if you like. All of that has built up to this time where there is a strongly polarized society. And I think COVID did erode trust in church leadership, but it's only like the latest thing. And I don't even know that I want to call it the straw that broke the camel's back, to use a cliche. I just think it brought a lot of these things that were already there to light. It exacerbated and accelerated. COVID exacerbated and accelerated problems that were already in place.
Yeah, so I would agree. And of course, we're not trying to make any moral judgment on the Trump candidacy or his presidency or COVID, for goodness sake. It's just talking about cultural elements that go into place. Also, another element to that is for a long time, the pastoral role has been spread so thin. And we sometimes joke about it, but it really is an issue to where pastors are expected to have some sort of informed idea on philosophy, on science, on biology, on sexual abuse and prevention and aftercare, on building programs and finance and nonprofit status and all this kind of stuff that where when we go to seminary and we study to exegete and to preach a passage, and then we get out and that is a very small sliver of what we actually get to do.
Preach the word, Josh. Just preach the word.
Yeah, of course.
The stupidest advice that has ever been given to a pastor. Stop saying that. It's stupid.
We're all trying to preach the word. We are just
you
trying
can't
to preach the word.
just preach the word. There is a whole lot of other things that are involved in pastoring a church.
Oh, so many things. HR and leadership and leadership dynamics and just the counseling, unpacking people's daddy wounds and addictions and just struggles that they have is enough to just wipe us out. And then we had to become, what is it called? Epidemiologists, like experts at
somethingologist. I don't even know.
We had to become experts at viral whatever. So when you get back,
what I was doing? I have a statistics background. I was actually doing my own statistical analysis on where I thought case numbers were going to go, early in the pandemic.
I remember that.
Yeah. And I remember telling my church, this is going to put me in a certain camp, but I don't care. I remember telling my church, guys, I don't think it's as bad as people are saying, just with the numbers that I see. And granted, people lost their lives and it was a very serious deal for a lot of people. And I certainly don't want to minimize pain or anybody that lost anyone or is struggling with the effects of COVID. But I remember telling my core leadership group, it's guys, we're not going to see a mortality rate of 50% with this. It's just not as bad as I think it is. But but that's neither here nor there. And it was polarizing in my own church. We had people leave because we regathered, and we lost people because they thought that we weren't taking enough precautions.
Yeah.
So it has eroded trust. I think COVID did erode trust.
I think it did. I think it exposed.
I think that's the bottom line, and I think it's still there. I think I think people have kind of made up their minds about the pandemic. I mean, goodness, it's middle of 2023 now, and it's a bit of an old story at this point. I mean, nobody's reporting on the pandemic; it's not on the news anymore. But those effects of a lack of trust are still there, and the people that left over those issues are still gone. And there's still probably some bitterness, maybe too strong of a word, but just a lack of trust that's out there. And again, I don't think the pandemic alone did all that. I think that these are a convergence of several factors, but I think we can look at 2020 as where, boom, it all just kind of,
erupted.
Forgive the phrase, it hit the fan is what happened.
Yeah. And in congregational models in which you have now groups that are empowered to be the experts. I think we just have the death of expertise. And so, leading a church gets intermingled with other things. And so it takes some real humility to lead into that. And I guess I'm asking the question is, what do we do going forward? Realizing that this is the new norm. We thought the new norm was going to be a lot of churches were going to close, a lot of the normative or smaller churches were going to close, larger churches were going to become more large. And to some degree that really happened. Largely what we were surprised by was how many churches did well financially when you have a whole year of still bringing in income and not doing anything. It really kind of helped fix a lot of things. And many of the churches I'm talking to are pre-COVID numbers. They're back to the way they were. But the way they're relating to one another within the church is drastically different.
Yes, and generally speaking, the larger churches suffered greater when it comes to attendance. There used to be like 1,700 megachurches in the United States, a little over 1,700 at its peak. And I would guess, though I don't have hard data, I would guess that we're under 1,000. By the old definition, some people are changing the definition of a megachurch. It used to be 2,000 in average weekly attendance, and now they're trying to make it like 1,500 or 1,800. So you can keep the same number.
2,000 in small group attendance made you a megachurch.
No, average weekly worship attendance.
Okay.
Average weekly worship over the course of a year. You average things out over the course of the year. But now we're trying to change the definition of a megachurch to 1,500 or 1,800. Well, you can keep the same number if you reduce what the metric is. But smaller churches obviously suffered as well. One thing we were wrong about at Church Answers in terms of our predictions was finances. We did not anticipate the massive amount of government stimulus that was going to come to churches. I mean, who would have thought that the government would have handed out money to nonprofits, particularly churches? You can think what you will about that. Some churches were glad to get it and others refused it, but it still happened and it kept a lot of churches afloat. You're right. There are a lot of churches that are getting back to pre-COVID numbers, or they're close. I mean, like at West Bradenton, we're close. We were at our peak before COVID, like the peak of the entire history of the church. So it's kind of hard to get back to that. But we're getting there. And I think a lot of churches would say that. We do know that churches are smaller generally because we see the median keep going down. What was a church of 150 is now a church of 75. And that's very, very common. By 150, I mean like 20 years ago. So the median used to be around 150. Now it's actually 65. So churches are getting smaller, and that would mean that even the largest churches are struggling. But I will say that what's different, that trend was in place before COVID. It just, again, accelerated and exacerbated by COVID. What's different is there is a culture in the church that there's a level of mistrust with leaders. But again, I would think that would be the case of any leadership, school systems, political leaders, pastors.
Clear.
I mean, I don't think pastors are getting singled out, I guess is what I'm saying. It's not like I distrust my pastor. And it's like I just distrust leaders, and pastors are feeling that.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that have So here's two things that I think really are unique to pastoral ministry, particularly established church, as we talk about this topic. One is that because of that diverse expertise that pastors are expected to have, none of us wanted it. It's just expected of us. That has corroded quite a few. So let's say you're expected to be pretty knowledgeable about 10 things, but we come back from COVID and it's exposed. It's like, hey, you don't actually know anything about 7 of these things. And you're saying, I know, I never did. And I never even acted like I did. And so you've got these 3 things and they all kind of play into each other. It's like, oh, you made a bad human resources decision during COVID or a bad facilities decision or a facilities decision that I don't agree with during COVID. Therefore, I don't trust your preaching anymore. And so it all got kind of lumped in together. So I think that is one of the things, whereas clearly our country has much more, like I'm talking about largely or across the board, distrust of the police now than we did 5-6 years ago. I think it's a tragedy. I think it's a bad thing, largely, not 100%, but largely. And yet, though, they are the law enforcement in your local community. There is no one else to call. I mean, when something's going down at your house, you're calling that group, right? And so it's just this unified kind of singular sort of focus. And so they can make steps more easily to build that trust in that one unified singular focus. Same thing with a school board. Same thing with they have a unified. Pastoral ministry has for a long time been considered like this community aspect, this like social aspect, this heart like my counseling, my free psychology that I get. And when all of that gets exposed as being not something we were ever supposed to be good at or try to be good at, then that kind of feeds into the other. So that's one thing. Another thing that really I don't think we really take into consideration as much as we should is this. We had a large group of people, primarily your older folks, who for let's just say 15, 16, maybe 17 months stopped attending out of fear or mandate or whatever. They were no longer gathering. And whatever your definition of the church is, a gathering of people is a part of that. Now, some people, again, change definitions to gathering online, but there's this gathering of people. So when you take out one of the key components of the church, 18 months, let's say, a group of people, primarily your older people, are no longer there. The leadership of the church is still trying to function, is still trying to provide, is still trying to minister, is still trying to do this. It fundamentally shifted their proximity and our responsibilities. Then at the end of it, they came back and they're looking around going, wait a second, everything changed. Well, yes, it changed. You weren't here for a year and a half. None of that was intentional. None of it was like anti that group. But in a lot of our established churches, especially in the South, a lot of our established churches, the largest givers, the long-term leaders are in that age. So you imagine stepping back into something a year and a half, forcing back your leadership that you feel like should have just kind of been on pause for the last year and a half. And then you've got this struggle of things changed. They did not change with you because you were out, and it wasn't your fault and it wasn't their fault. But whose fault is it? The pastor. And so you start going after the guy in the front, you know?
Yeah. And that's inevitable in any leadership role. Like,
oh yeah,
the one that's out in front, the one that's on the stage, the ones on the TV. Yeah, that's the target. And if you don't want that, don't be a pastor. Don't be a lead pastor. Like, that's just part of the gig. Sorry.
Yep.
You know, you really shouldn't complain about that. But I think you've touched on something. You said, you know, you made a bad call about the facility, so I don't trust your preaching. And that is so true.
Yeah.
And what we have largely lost a sense of in our culture, and I'm not just singling out pastors or churches here, this is just as a whole, is we no longer look at a person in holistically. Mm-hmm. We will assign things to that person if they make one bad call, thinking that it affects every part of who they are.
Yeah.
And so a legitimately good leader who generally makes really good calls will be perceived as a bad leader because that one call you did, I don't like. And we've lost a sense of considering the whole of a person. And this is how good leaders can be viewed as bad leaders. And frankly, this is how bad leaders can be viewed positively, because you did the one thing that is important to me. Yeah, you're a really trashy person. You're a really trashy person, but that one thing I like. So I'm now going to assign goodness to you in the same way I may assign badness to an otherwise good leader because I just didn't agree with that one call. And I think that this is due to the polarization of our society, generally speaking. But again, this doesn't apply to pastors specifically. It's just every leader. And honestly, I don't know a way around it for like the next 10 years. When we say, did COVID permanently change trust? I mean, I think we're in a funk for a little while here. We can come out of it, of course. And is it really permanent? No, it's not really permanent. But this is a long-term problem that we're going to have to solve. And I don't see it being solved in the next 12 months at all.
Yeah. So I think where it relates, or again, it's acute for pastors, is that whole like expertise, that broad range of expertise. There are people within churches that really do look towards the church to fulfill an organizational need that they want. They want to be a part of an organization that is well ran, that is, is giving lots of money in this direction or runs really nice facilities. They want to have something that when they drive by, they say, I'm part of that, the same way that people say, I'm a part of that country club, that sort of stuff. So when you primarily look at the church in that function in your life, then you expect the pastor to be really kind of pushing that function. Same goes if there are people, and there are a lot of people who look to the church to primarily scratch that like psychological or that emotional baggage itch that I have, and so pastor's going to give me free counseling. I'm going to feel good about myself weekly. We've got that. On and on. It's going to be my nonprofit. It's going to be my charity. It's going to be whatever it is. And then you go through this global pandemic where there's just tough decisions needed to be made. And so people are making different decisions, whereas the pastor was always going, hopefully he or she was always going, I think my primary role is to shepherd these people spiritually. So I was making, not me, but like a pastor might say, I was making organizational decisions from a spiritual point of view. They wouldn't necessarily be financially lucrative, but it was for spiritual point of view. So, that sort of stuff. And so again, you failed me on, I don't know, whatever, psychological reasons. Therefore, you are not a good pastor. I will not listen to your preaching. And the preaching was always fine. The spiritual direction, the shepherding was good. It's just that intermingling that I think. So my advice is for us to be, as church leaders, to be much more candid and open about when we do not know. So you walk into a room and you go, hey, I don't know a whole lot about church bank rates. I'm not keeping up with that stuff. I don't know about stock investments. But, Susan over here and John, they do. Let's ask them and let's put them into that. So I think if we can be much more transparent about that, some of this whole like diverse pretending that we're experts at stuff is on us. We've been acting like that for some time, and maybe we should stop doing that to get back to normal.
So really what you're saying is the answer to this problem is congregational polity.
Congregational involvement is what I'm saying. I haven't thought about it in polity terms, but maybe.
Yeah, if you just got you got 4 or 5 elders making all the calls, they can't possibly know everything, right? I am certainly showing my ecclesiological cards there. Sorry, those of you who disagree with me on ecclesiology. It's a great point that you're making. And I think the answer is, and I'm going to give you an answer that nobody's going to like. All right. I'm going to tell you what I think will happen. I don't think it's a good thing, but I think this is what's going to happen. I think you're going to see more shuffling around. I think there's going to be pastors that just say, you know what? I've got too much baggage from the last 3 or 4 years. There's just been too much that's built up. Maybe it's not even your fault. Maybe you actually did make good calls. People think you made bad calls. It doesn't matter. It's just like, I've got too much baggage. I'm going to have to go restart somewhere. And you're going to be able to do that because there's a lot of retiring baby boomers. So there's going to be a ton of churches available. And if you want to make a move, I mean, like you kind of started this show with, it may be a lateral move or it may even be a little smaller church. But I mean, you're going to be able to make a move here in the next 5-10 years. If you want to, in the next couple of years, if you want to. And so I think a lot of people will. I don't know that that's healthy for the church, but I think it's
not necessarily
reality. And it's something you and I are already seeing with our peers. I mean, there's just a lot of people moving around right now, particularly people in their 30s and 40s, because they can go places. And the last 3 or 4 years it's just like, I can't lead these people anymore. Like there's just even the people that love me and agree with me, it's just too much there. And thankfully at West Bradenton, I will say this, I have a high level of trust. I think we're an anomaly. And I don't know, I've talked positively about my church on previous shows. So I just want everyone to know, I still think that about my church. In fact, we've got a gigantic, at the time of this recording, we just announced a gigantic capital campaign for air conditioners. We're taking 60 units and we're putting them all on one, and it's going to cost a little north of $2 million. So you've got to have, we got 61,000 square feet, in Florida. And don't give me one. I'll take 61,000 more square feet of parking because we don't have any parking, but I don't need more buildings. You can listen to the last episode with Rob Paul about Huffman Baptist. Like, I don't need any more buildings. I'm done with buildings. And like what you said, you're building these giant worship spaces, in the last episode. No, I don't want any of that. If, a church that's like, hey, we're in a growing community and our sanctuary seats 5,000, I'm going to be like, I'm out. I don't want that.
Yeah, I think 1,000 is kind of like your peak, your sweet spot peak in growing suburbs. Some areas maybe a little smaller, but
I put it more like 500-600, but that's
oh,
just
really?
me.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Well, I would just say, like,
in Texas, it may be different. Maybe 1,000
in some southern places. I would say this. Look, we're not saying that all churches are functioning this way. It's just that Sam and I are both hearing this story quite a bit. So if you're listening and you're like, man, I'm resonating with this. I'm feeling like no one is accusing me of immorality. Nobody's accusing me of a sin. They're just acting like I did. And it's like they're doing this and they're saying, man, that's just kind of a norm thing right now. And so I hope that it's encouraging to you to go, all right, so this isn't really unique. This is something we need to think through how we're going to go forward. And I think on the table needs to be all things. One of them is just like kind of letting people know I'm not an expert at these things. Another thing may be a shuffle and a move. Like we said with this lateral move, I think sometimes the pastors, the church leaders are thinking, I don't necessarily want the big organization anymore. I just let them through a global. I want something smaller, closer to home or something, along those lines. But we've ran out of time, but at least the point is to say, hey, you're not unusual.
You're not alone. You're not alone. It's not if you're experiencing this, it's common. And if you're like, hey, my church really trusts me. I came out of COVID looking pretty good. Man, good for you. Like, I would say you're more in the minority than the majority on that one.
So kudos for you.
Certainly want to thank our sponsor, Church Teams. Go to est.church to get the free offer. And also want to thank Church Answers. We have at Church Answers different levels of subscription. So at our silver level, we have a forum. It's called Church Answers Central that you can get into, and people are in there every hour of every day. It is absolutely fascinating. People wonder, like, where do you get all your church research? Where do you get all your ideas? I'm like, I tell everyone it's in Church Answers Central. That is literally where I get all of my ideas for everything. And if you're interested just in following along at ground level with what's happening in churches, that's where you can go. If you're like, I've got questions, I need answers. Well, that's why we exist. So go get that silver membership. Just go to churchanswers.com, click on join. We have a gold membership as well. And at the gold level, which isn't really all that much more, most people are transitioning to gold anyway. You get all our know your tools, know your community, know your church, know yourself, which is really good. Particularly, I like to know your community report because, I created it. And then the platinum level, we do one-on-one coaching. We are available 24/7. My dad and I and other coaches are available 24/7 at the platinum level. And that's a limited number of people. But if that is something that interests you, like that personal coaching, Sam at churchanswers.com. Otherwise, you can sign up for Church Answers, go to the join button, and we'd love to have you.
Yeah, and we're in the midst of a season of just asking you as a listener to participate in growing the show. One thing we're asking you to do is to text that group of friends. We know that most church leaders are in a text thread of other church leaders. And so we're going to ask you to go ahead and jump back into that group thread. Mine's actually called TXP. Sam, do you have a particular little group thread that you named, or is it just like a group of peoples?
It's just a group of people. I've got some local pastors here that I communicate with, and we send each other inappropriate memes.
You need to name it. I was in one time called Punching Koalas. There's a whole history of, so Punching Koalas no longer in that one. I'm now in one called TXP. But anyhow, we want you to jump back into that little group thread, that text message thread there, and go, have you guys listened to this episode? Have you all listened to EST? Use that and help us to grow the show, because it's not about the numbers. It's not about growing the show. It's about resourcing churches coming alongside like this episode where we encourage one another. But thank you so much. Your listening to us encourages us, and we will catch you next week.